Why the oil and gas industry? Serendipity to some extent. I'd originally wanted to go into politics and indeed had applied for a graduate position at the European Commission in Brussels, but the process took way too long. I was attracted equally by the geopolitics of the oil industry, and indeed my first job in Shell was as a junior member of the team responsible for negotiating the crude oil supply contracts with OPEC. My first business trip was to Syria, which, in my book at least, was a very promising start. Well, after 3 years in London, I was posted by Shell to Vientiane to run Shell in Laos. It was 1980, I was 27. It was 5 years after the end of the Vietnam War. Shell was actually the only Western company still operating in the country. And interestingly, despite the communist zeal of the Pathet Lao, the business language of the country was still French. My predecessor asked me on arrival whether they'd told me in London that I would be the company doctor. He added helpfully that there were no doctors in Laos. He exaggerated by one. The Minister of Health was the last remaining qualified doctor in the country. Sure enough, I inherited a UN publication succinctly called Where There Is No Doctor, and kept the best medical cabinet in the country. At 5 o'clock every afternoon, my office became the surgery. I would prescribe as best I could, my secretary would dispense, and away we went for 3 years. Now, because Laos was poor and inflation rife, the bulk of the remuneration package for staff, for local staff, was in kind. We farmed our own chickens at one of the depots. As I recall, each member of staff is entitled to 6 chickens every 5 weeks. And with the help of the UNDP, we started a fish farm, and we're producing from fish fry over 4,000 fish every 4 months or so. In between, we imported petroleum product through Thailand and Vietnam, operating 5 depots so up and down the country. And we did all the aviation refueling, both for domestic and international, and for the Lao Air Force, all 21 MiGs at the time. The real training it gave me was in terms of leadership and flexibility. Dealing with a lot of different situations, as I've described. It was very different. Being based in Vientiane, I reported down to Bangkok, but the phone lines only worked 1 day in 7, and certainly not when it was inconvenient for me to have to report. So, it was a lot of responsibility. I had about 200 staff across the 5 depots, and I was dealing with government, negotiating in-transit quotas through Thailand with the Thais on the one hand, and then having to maintain good relations with the Soviets on the other, who were actually subsidizing most of the imports into the country. After Laos, I moved back to London as Deputy Treasurer of Shell in the UK. It was a monumental shift, after Laos. And that was 83, 84 by this stage. It was the start of the North Sea boom. And it was really where I cut my teeth in terms of real financial experience. I mean, looking back, it was actually remarkable of Shell to afford me that opportunity at the time, given my very limited corporate credentials. But that was the advantage of joining a company like Shell and having a multiplicity of different experiences. The other thing that the Shell experience gave me was my introduction to Asia, obviously starting in Laos. But in my last position in Shell, we're now sort of 85, 86, I was Assistant Area Coordinator for the Far East, as it was then called. And in that role, I had the privilege of helping to coordinate Shell's re-entry into China, the merger of Shell and Sekyu in Japan, and for a period I was assigned to Seoul as the acting managing director of the Shell companies in Korea. All in all, I had a remarkable 10 years with Shell. Well, I guess in simple terms, the grass looked greener on the other side. I mean, this was a product of the times. We're now into the mid-80s, certainly pre the October 1987 crash. My friends who were working in the city seemed to be having a far more adventurous time. Certainly they were earning more money. And with a young family, we decided to combine the change in career with a move to Australia, although for various reasons it actually took us 3 years to get there via New Zealand and then Canada. But I joined a group that became part of Credit Suisse First Boston, and from the start, I was focused on investment banking in the resources sector. My first transaction was a successful hostile takeover of a company called Segasco by Boral, the energy division of which was subsequently demerged and became part of Origin Energy. But for me it was a great start, and in retrospect led to a specialization in M&A and corporate advisory work throughout my 21 years in investment banking. Initially, as I said, with CS First Boston, and then later with JP Morgan. It was actually with JP Morgan that I left Australia in 2001 to head up the energy and natural resources investment banking business in Asia, based initially in Japan, and then from 2005 in Hong Kong. Ironically, probably the two most memorable transactions never actually got across the line, but they were landmark events in their own right. The first was Shell's takeover offer for Woodside Petroleum in 2000, which the government eventually ruled was against the national interest. The FIRB review alone extended for 120 days, and over the 9 months or so of the transaction, we averaged 40 pages of newsprint every day. I'd have to say that every newswire and every financial journalist in the country became my best friend. The second very memorable transaction was CNOOC's takeover offer for Unocal in 2005, which again turned on national interest issues, this time CFIUS. It was the first time that a Chinese national oil company had stepped onto the world stage in a contested takeover offer. And people tend to forget that at the time CNOOC reluctantly withdrew its offer. Its bid was actually still well over $1 billion higher than Chevron's. PE was a very natural transition, and indeed I wished we'd done it earlier. But sector specialization came late to private equity in Asia. In the event, we formed our first fund, which was called Ancora Capital, in early 2008 as a diversified energy and natural resources fund, which is to say it included mining as well as oil and gas. But when we came to form the first Kerogen fund in 2011, we decided to focus exclusively on energy and predominantly upstream oil and gas, because that's where we saw the opportunities. It was also the industry that we knew best. Not from the point of view that I'd had the benefit of working in industry as well as investment banking, but that's not to understate the challenge of moving from the so-called sell side to the buy side, although I'd characterize it a little differently. Investment banking is a service industry. It's a transaction-oriented industry. Private equity is an ownership model. It requires an ownership mentality, including a lot of attention to detail. You live with the consequences of your decision. As a parent, there's a well-known adage that you're only ever as happy as your least happy child, the same is actually true of private equity. It's the portfolio companies that are doing it tough that inevitably take up the bulk of one's energy and resources. The single thing that has kept us most awake at night has been the challenge of ensuring that our portfolio companies are adequately funded over the investment life cycle. That was especially true in the 2014-2017 period of oil price weakness, when international M&A activity and capital markets liquidity virtually dried up. Oh, I don't know. I think surrounding myself always with good people is a key to success. And within Kerogen, I've had the benefit of an investments team that I've worked with for 10, 15, in some cases 20 years and more. We have our own in-house technical team that is vital not only when we're coming to make decisions, but equally again throughout the life of those investments. And not least, we have a stellar advisory board who play a key role in all of our important decision making, and who individually a number of important roles, whether as directors of a number of our portfolio companies, or in the case of Alan Parsley, for example, as chair of our internal technical committee. I always say in the business, it's about people and assets in that order. Oh, I think there are different kinds of leaders. There are leaders who lead from the front and who fly the flag and are very articulate. But in the corporate world, a number of the most successful leaders I'd characterize as people who just lead by example. They're in the trenches, they're doing the hard yards, and people will model themselves, around that example. That's a difficult question. In essence, I love the industry. It's never less than interesting. Intellectually, I enjoy it at a macro level in terms of the complexity of supply and demand, not just within oil and gas, but across the energy spectrum, coupled with the geopolitical overlay. I enjoy projects. I enjoy transactions. In general, making things happen when they didn't exist before. But as I was saying earlier, again, it's about people. In the course of my career, I've met a lot of people. I've worked with some incredibly hardworking professional people. But above all else, over the years, I've made a lot of friends in the industry. Over the 40 years, we've seen, a number of both demand shocks and supply shocks, and that's what makes it interesting. The current energy transition that we're witnessing is arguably the greatest challenge that I've seen in my 40 years in the industry. But it is a resilient industry, and energy transitions by their nature are drawn out affairs. So from a Kerogen perspective, at least, I have every confidence that while we have and will be investing in renewables, that oil and gas will remain the core part of our portfolio. Under almost any scenario, or at least any realistic scenario, approximately 50% of the primary energy mix will come from oil and gas, and we will be part of that.